Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Behavioral Grooves focuses on the applications of behavioral science. And we share conversations with researchers who are testing cool theories, practitioners who have great observations and outstanding applications, and accidental behavioral scientists who pull all the best thinking into place, but just without the behavioral science terminology.
And we do it while having a lot of fun.
Yes, we do.
Well, I hope so.
At least today.
Yeah. And we're glad to say that we've been able to record conversations with some of the Hall of Famers of behavioral science. And we're going to rattle off a few for you. All right. Like Robert Cialdini, episode 50, John Barge, episode 155, and Gary Latham, episode 147. Whoa. That's not it. That's not it. We have Christina Bacchieri, episodes 102 and 133, not just one, but two. Wendy Wood, episode 128, Rory Sutherland, episode 107, and Annie Duke. Oh my gosh, Annie Duke, episode 31, 88, 100, and 125. Wow. I think we like Annie. Oh, we also have Barry Ritholtz, episodes 47 and 121, and the very wonderful but hard to get on a podcast, George Lowenstein, episode 67.
Yeah, that was a coup. Holy smokes. And we've had tons of fantastic researchers and practitioners that aren't household names that we've shared some fantastic ideas on marketing, like Will Leach and Jonathan Mann or James Brewer, or the brilliant folks that we've talked to about their insights on improving sales incentives, with ideas from Mike Ahern and Tom Steenberg and Paul Hebert. And we've also had great conversations with how to improve employee engagement with people like Chris Dobbins and Brad Schuck.
Yeah. What we're trying to say is all of this is one thing. If you're new to Behavioral Grooves, check out some of our past episodes because they just might surprise you.
And you can do that at www.behavioralgrooves.com. And at the same time, you might want to check out our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/behavioralgrooves.com to lay down some super subscription mojo of your own.
Subscription mojo?
Yeah, that's like something that more and more people are getting into every single day, man. They're doing their subscription mojo.
Okay, subscription mojo it is. All right, well, let's get on to our guest for this episode.
Okay, good call, Kurt. In this episode, we're going to hear from Steve Wendell, the head of behavioral science at Morningstar Funds.
Steve recently released a second edition of his book called Designing for Behavior Change, and we think it's a terrific framework for behavior change initiatives. While the book focuses on practical application, it's built on a rigorous foundation of solid research. Steve shared some of his insights from his book as well.
Yeah, he did, Kurt. And we talked to him about the DECIDE framework and what makes behavioral science different from the traditional approaches taken by psychology, economics, sociology, and neuroscience. It was a really great discussion.
That was good. And we discussed where behavioral science fits in the corporate world in ethical ways. You'll find Tim and I scratching our heads in awe almost as much as we were laughing. So with that, sit back, relax, and enjoy a fine glass of a decision-making cocktail as you listen to our conversation with Steve Wendell.
Steve Wendell, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We are glad to have you here.
It is going to be fun. Very, very fun.
So let's get started with the speed round. Steve, which would you prefer, dinner with your favorite musician or a favorite sports player?
Oh, favorite musician.
Good answer.
All right, Tim. Tim is grooving on that one. All right. So coffee or tea?
I didn't realize there was a thing called coffee.
Oh,
tea, of course.
Oh, nice. Okay, there we go.
Monet or Michelangelo?
Ooh, okay, that one's a little harder. I think I'm going Michelangelo.
Great. Okay.
All right. First edition of a book or second edition of a book? Which is easier?
Oh, second edition.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Well, let's go on that for a little bit. You are writing the second edition of this book that's going on. Tell us a little bit about that. What is this? Why on a second edition and what's going on? What's changed from the first edition that you needed to go and do a second edition?
Yeah, so the short version is just about bloody everything. I mean, the field has changed so radically. So the first edition of Designing for Behavior Change was, initially it was really a manual for my team at Hello Wallet, right? It was, okay, here's how we can take this literature on behavioral science, on how the mind works, and apply it to product development, right? And beyond what we were doing and really just trying out, there just weren't many other companies, right? The field has changed radically. Now we actually have a field. And we've learned so much about that process. And we've really settled on, as I've talked to dozens of other companies and teams, we've settled on a common approach to designing for behavior change. And so that's what the book is about. It's about how the mind works, how you apply that in product and communications in order to help people change behavior. And then we also talk about, what's going on in the field.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these changes, right? Because if there have been so many changes in these years, what do you think are the most salient changes that you saw as you went back to write the second edition?
Yeah, I mean, I really think about it as diversity. So wrote the first edition 7 years ago, and it came out just under that. At that time, there were applications of behavioral science outside of the universities in finance and starting in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all basically the UK and the US. Now, there was a smattering otherwise, but that was really the heavy concentration. And it was primarily seeded by academic researchers. All of that has changed. We see the diversity of application, right? We see just the establishment in marketing, product design, HR, and international development and policy. Those are the big areas. We see it across companies, so it's not just finance and healthcare now, right? You see it in, of course, energy sector. Opower was one of the pioneers there. Now it's all over, right? You see it in hygiene behavior. You see lots of new work about COVID and behavioral science, which, of course, I know you guys have featured some of on behavioral groups. Well done. So that's kind of in the application areas. When we look geographically, right, the US and the UK don't even have the majority anymore. It's Netherlands. It's South Africa. There's a group in Armenia. There's a big group. There's a big set of companies and policy groups as well in Peru. I spoke to a lawyer who's starting the first group in Paraguay. It's all over the world now, and it's awesome, and it's no longer just English speaking.
You mentioned HR. So
Yep.
how do you see behavioral science being applied in HR? Because again, in the work that we've done, both Tim and I, we tend to work internally within organizations, and so we're seeing that. But part of our big push on this that has been this idea that we're just trying to battle against the headwinds, because while marketing uses this stuff because that's with the consumer and they can run all these tests and do different things, right. But then applying these principles internally inside of an organization, what are you talking about? So
Sure.
How have you seen it being applied within HR?
Sure. So first of all, I would say the Penn Wharton group that Katie Milkman set up is a great place to. They actually know what they're talking about. Let me give you my summary of what I believe other people know what they're talking about. So when I look across HR and the folks I've spoken to, I see three different main areas of application right now. Right?
Okay.
One is employee engagement and employee behavior. Okay, that's to me stereotypical. Google changing the layout of the cafeteria so that people will spend a little bit more time thinking of what they want to eat, right, for example, and perhaps make it easier to get the water rather than the soda, okay? And that's the people analytics group, Jessica Wisdom, other folks there at Google, right? That's one area. The second area is diversity and inclusion. There's been some really great work, and the book that I recommend there, and the writing I recommend is Iris Bonet out of Harvard has a book called What Works, and it's a summary of this broad literature, some of which she's done, some of which other people have done, in looking at the hiring practices, right? How we structure hiring so that we're not getting people like me, right?
or me or Tim. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Exactly. Enough said.
White guys shouldn't aren't representative of the overall population.
Yeah.
And so how do we not discriminate against folks like us, but rather how do we just make a system that's more fair? And there's just wonderful work in that area. Of course, the BIT in the UK has done work in this area, and they spun off the company Applied to help with this. But there's much broader literature that Iris Benet talks about. And then there's also some work, actually, I think it's out of Germany, if I remember correctly, on inclusion nudges, which is more broadly looking at changing the everyday work environment to help inclusion. Most of the work we've seen is in diversity. So increasing the pool. Inclusion is really about welcoming people who are already there. And then the final area is kind of is organizational change. And this one I know much less about, but I'm starting to see there's of course a long-standing literature and tradition in organizational psychology. And I'm starting to see some more crossover of experimental organizational psychology, stuff like that. That's much more behavioral sciencey.
Yeah.
What makes it more behavioral sciencey? Because I think that this is interesting. Like we think about behavioral science as being a relatively new thing. You even talked about it as we now have a field that we talk about behavioral science, right? And yet psychology has been around, economics has been around, neuroscience has been around. Psychology has a 100-year plus history. But there is a change, right? There's something different between Sigmund Freud and what we consider behavioral science today.
And thanks for that.
Hey, I just want to find my id. All right, that's really all I'm in for. So
yeah. It's under the couch. But Steve, what do you think differentiates sort of traditional psychological approaches, or something like organizational psychology, from what we consider behavioral science today?
Sure. The way that I define behavioral science, the way that I teach it is my own, with an understanding that there is a diversity of opinion in the field, right? But the way that I look at it is really three things. First, it is a specific understanding of the mind and of the shortcuts that the mind takes. Okay, so it's a particular literature that came out of cognitive psychology mixed with economics, right? That then blossomed and grew and included more of social psychology, but not necessarily all of it, right? It's a particular understanding of the imperfection of the human mind and how we take, whether you call them smart or foolish, either way, shortcuts, right? So it's either Gingrenzer, smart shortcuts, or a more Kahneman, foolish shortcuts. But either way, a set of shortcuts that help us overcome some of our limitations, but they themselves are incomplete, right? So that's one. It's an understanding of the mind. Second, it's a set of tools experimentally tested in the field to help overcome these obstacles. Right. Now, most people, when they think of behavioral science, when they read nudge, when they read predictable, irrational, etc., they get this bag of tricks approach. They think of it just as that second area, which is, oh, here's this thing. Oh, I could use loss aversion. And that's an important part of behavioral science. But I think, honestly, it's the least important part. Right. The third area, the part that I think is most important, is a structural belief in experimentation. And I know this is going to be controversial, folks. I know that. But I think about it as it's not experimentation for its own sake. It's a building into the process and building into our research and understanding that we're probably wrong. I call it like an epistemic humility, that we fundamentally believe at the core of our research that human beings are really complex and that contexts matter, and that it's a really even dangerous thing to say, I've got the answer on how to change behavior.
We've seen, I want to dig into that a little bit, because I think we've seen people who have talked about that, right? Who have brought in this idea that we need to experiment. We were talking, Tim, help me with the name from Uber.
Candace.
Owen? No,
Candace Hogan.
Hogan, thank you.
I think I think she may have gotten married and changed her name.
Yeah, I think that might have been true. And one of the things that she was talking about was, the idea of using those experiments, and where behavioral science came in. She said, look, our decision sciences group have been doing experiments since day one here. We have done A/B tests. Marketing does it all of the time. So you think about experimentation, that in and of itself isn't enough. Where she was seeing some of this, and where I believe too that behavioral science plays a role, is you do an A/B test and you say, well, A works better than B, or B works better than C, but you don't necessarily understand the mechanics behind why A works better than B, or why B works better than C, where behavioral science helps getting some of that insight. And so then you can create better experiments next time and keep improving upon those. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's the combination of the first area, which is this particular understanding of the mind, and really a theory. Theory about how the mind works and where we expect these challenges to arise with the experimental verification. And to be clear, people have been running experiments for a very long time, right? And experimental economics is a wonderful and thoughtful field. We've had an understanding of the mind, and we have different theories, of course, dating back centuries. It's, again, this particular literature on shortcuts, on how these go awry, on our mind's limitations, on bounded rationality, right? That bundle combined with experiments, combined with the history of really the bag of tricks is our record of prior experiments.
Yeah.
Right? Those three things together, to me, make behavioral science. And when someone goes out, and there are lots of groups that do consulting and apply behavioral science and apply these lessons, I think it's a very valuable thing to do. And I personally, I use a different term for that. I call that behavioral consulting, or I call that behavioral design. The science part is you're checking whether you're right. And in most cases, you'll find you're not.
Yeah. Well, even within organizations, even if you are doing behavioral consulting or behavioral design, one of the things that we see is that context is so important in this, that what we can have these generalized beliefs or ideas, or even these bag of tricks, as you said, that apply, and they work great in most instances. But hey, this instance, it doesn't work. And we've talked with Michael Hallsworth about some, again, some of the best insights that he's gotten are from these experiments that he thought for sure were going to be great, and they failed. And this idea of always making sure that you're testing, always making sure that you are experimenting, because the context is so important in this. And so even if you're doing behavioral design, you may be applying some of these scientific aspects, but you better be testing it out as well, because you know what? Company A may look a lot like company B, but there are some small differences, and those small differences can make big changes.
Exactly. And I'm not a purist that says it always has to be a capital E experiment. Rather, we should assume that something's going to go wrong. We should assume that people are different and context is different in subtle ways, and we should always be testing.
Yeah. So I'm wondering what, given this epistemic humility, I love that term. Thinking about that, how do you think about the replication crisis? Or I'm using this massively generalized term here, but what do you think about replication in general when it comes to the capital E experiments?
Sure. So I think the replication crisis is the exposing of two different things. One is some actual real shoddy work.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second is it's a grappling with the differences of context and the complexities of human behavior. And I think at times we've reached for universals where there aren't any. And we should always assume that our interventions are context dependent. That's what behavioral science is. We're studying the context. We're studying how it affects things. And so we shouldn't be surprised when the context matters.
But we are. Why are we? Why is that a surprise?
I don't know if I can even answer that question without resorting to a universal. Because we all like universals. See, there, I just used one.
Yeah.
It's natural to look for a general structure. And I think instead, the phrase that I use with my team is, I want to know the structure of applicability. I want to know the circumstances under which we believe this works. if somebody says we have the answer always, I'm like, nope, I don't think you have it anywhere then.
Yeah.
Because it's just, God, this stuff is hard.
It is. It is hard. So,
and here we are laughing.
Yeah, we're laughing. Oh, it's hard.
Like for laughing at my pain. Yes, I appreciate
it. Fun hard, right? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. No, it is. It is a fun. It's a fascinating. It is an awesome hard. It's just it's just how it is.
Yeah.
I mean, people are complex.
People are complex, and that's what's the fascinating part. If they were simple, they were robots, this would be, I wouldn't be excited about this at all. I'd be like, well, yeah, you just program them and they do X, you plug and play and boom. That's not how we work.
So you could have been a coder though, Kurt. I just think you could have gone into development and just created computers.
God, I would have
exactly what you wanted every time, right?
I would be horrible.
No. For the record, I have to say there are actually a lot of similarities between software engineering and thoughtful behavioral science. I used to be a software engineer, and maybe I'm the only person who sees those parallels, right? So one of the early compilers in Unix, when it compiled your code and checked for errors, if it didn't find any, it would say, none of your bugs were found. And the beauty is, right, it's saying that, look, everybody's code is wrong.
Yeah.
Just as with everybody's behavioral interventions are wrong. The question is, how many of the errors are you finding? How quickly are you finding them, right? Are you building a process that allows you to become a little bit less wrong?
We talked to Gary Latham recently, and he was just ranting on this idea of using inductive reasoning, to start with. Just don't start with a theory. Don't start with, I know that this is what I'm going out to prove. Start with, I don't know what I'm going to prove. I've got an idea. I want to test it. And I think that fits perfectly with this idea of epistemic humility, to say, I'm not really sure if there's a theory here at all. We're just going to find out what happens.
Well, you have to have. He's saying you have a hypothesis. You have some idea,
sure.
but this idea of let's just gather a bunch of data and then let's make sure that data shows. Because the idea, and one of the things that he brought up, is this idea of, well, if we just find enough information to prove our theory, then we typically stop. And he said, so that it's just like you. It's like we just haven't found the bugs. We've only experimented enough to say this works, as opposed to keep going and finding more bugs.
Exactly.
I love that analogy though of finding bugs, because I think it's so true. So
no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So I want to ask, given this idea that we tend to want to generalize, and yet within behavioral science we understand that probably isn't the best way of doing things, and that we're context dependent and we're complex creatures. The idea of marrying machine learning, AI, in with behavioral science, where you are getting very specific interventions because of the power of computers and the software that we have today, and being able to apply a particular behavioral science intervention to Tim, that is going to be different than it is to me versus different to, Joe Schmo down the street. Where do you see that leading? And what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's awesome. So I think there are a variety of ways that we can combine data science and AI with behavioral science. And I think one of them is this personalization. And to be frank, our research in behavioral science hasn't done a great job there, because we've been looking for these universals. And instead, we should look at the particulars. Who can we serve, under what circumstances, and who are we hurting? Because if we haven't found where it backfires, then it just means we haven't found it. It's still there. There's somebody for whom this doesn't work. And so how do we get past the averages? How do we get past the point effect and say, okay, for whom is this the right intervention? For whom might there be a better intervention? And one of the ways that you can combine that is by, and this is where behavioral science has gone, is by a mediator or moderator analysis. Look at intervening variables, right? But those are our initial sets of tools. We can bring in much more bigger guns, shall we say, from machine learning to say, okay, let's better understand the structure of this impact and the causes of treatment responsiveness, right? Of where this treatment is effective and where people respond to it. And then let's model accordingly. That's one approach, right? Another approach is just let people self-select. So, and this is the low-tech version where you take your best shot based on their data and say, hey, I think you should do this, but maybe I'm wrong. Here are the other things that you can try too.
Oh my
gosh! And then actually the approach, I'm not smart enough to take to use the big guns, so I've used that low-tech approach in the past.
And to what end? I'm curious, because I think about there's all kinds with all of the biases that we have for whatever circumstance that this is occurring in. How successful is self-selection in general? Here we are back to the universals.
We can't avoid them. We're human. And it really depends on what type of self-selection, right? So let me give you a concrete example. I've done a fair bit of work on personal finance and helping people budget and save for the future, right? And if you say, okay, we're going to just tell people they should save, and those who really need to save, well, they'll go save, and those who won't. No, that's a type of self-selection that's just ignorant of the limitations of the mind, right? But an approach we tried, and I think it's better, right? And the data showed us it seemed better, is to say, look, lots of people have problems. We all have problems. Okay, looking at your data, Tim, looking at your data, Kurt, it looks like in your case, Kurt, you're struggling with, let's say it's credit card debt, right? And Tim, you're struggling with, sorry, man. And Tim, you're struggling with emergency savings. It looks like you've paid off the debts, but you're struggling in this area. And here's some techniques that can help with emergency savings for you and credit card for you. And so then it's much more about not do people see the need, but rather have you correctly identified the problem, and then you are supplying the solutions. Right? The challenge is people often can recognize they have a problem. And this occurs in so many aspects of product design and design work overall, that people may recognize a problem, but they can't articulate or don't know what the right solution is. I know that I don't exercise enough. I know my problem. I need behavioral science to help me solve that.
So part of that, it seems like it's removing some friction. Part of that seems like framing the problem statement in a way that is actually drives some engagement or motivation or action out of things.
Yeah.
What else? When you think about the pieces that are actually going to get people to move, how do we get people to if we know that we have a problem, but we're not doing anything about it? What are some of the ways that you guys are? You're talking about design, right? It's about designing products and services. That's obviously a big piece of this. How do you go about doing that? How do you get people to actually change?
Well, if I might make a big leap here, there's this book I wrote. It kind of talks about how to do that. So first,
never saw that one coming.
Whew, yeah.
Wow. Laid out the softball for you. Laid out the softball. So, there you go.
Yeah. So there are a set of preconditions for action. And I personally look at voluntary action.
Okay.
Right? I'm not looking at how to coerce people. I'm not looking how to persuade them. Something where people, if they thought about it, would see, yes, I have a problem. Okay. So in those circumstances where there is actually value to the user to taking an action, well, the first and biggest problem that most people face is attention. You might, as the product designer, as the product manager, you might be thinking about this problem and how important it is and how people should really be solving it, like saving for the future, etc. They're playing with their kids or driving their car to work, maybe not right now, but whatever it might be, right? They're living their lives and your problem isn't top of mind, right? And so the first thing we need to think about is why would people actually think about this, right? And then once the mind has attention to a problem, it has generally an immediate reaction. That is your system one, your intuitive sense. Is this right for me? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? How do I feel about this emotionally? And it is blazingly fast, right? And it can lead us astray. So, for example, when I think about exercise often, primarily because I don't do it enough, when I think about exercise, right, I think about, okay, yeah, I think I need to get in shape. It's healthy for me. I also think, man, I'm really skinny and very white. And I'm going to look really funny in my gym shorts. And I'm serious. That's been right, I'm just laying it out there, right? That's been a problem. Like, I haven't wanted to go to the gym because I look funny. I'm a skinny white guy, right? And so even though the benefits are so clear, long-term and short-term, right? I feel better, etc. That emotional reaction matters. Now, what I'm giving is I'm walking step by step through a framework called CREATE. Cue, reaction, evaluation, ability, timing, and experience. Because these, as you look across the broad literature in behavioral science, these are the major in-the-moment obstacles that people face. Not paying attention to it, having a strong emotional reaction that's, we would call irrational, but it's human, right? The costs, at least in the moment, seem to outweigh the benefits, and particularly we look at temporal myopia, issues like that, right? Present bias. Ability, where you actually can't take the action, or you don't have a sense of self-efficacy. You don't believe you can, right? And this is Bandura's work, for example, building on that. And then timing, that's our good old-fashioned friend, procrastination, right? Is it urgent now? Why would I do it now? And many of the things that are good for us are just not all that urgent. Saving for the future, exercise, spending more time with your family, all of those things you could do tomorrow, right? And then finally, the final E is experience, which is just a recognition that regardless of what it looks like on paper, whether something looks right for a person, whether it looks like they might be okay with it and it's urgent and all that stuff, if they were burned in the past, especially with your product, you've got a real problem. Because that prior experience is what colors. Well, it actually colors every step of it. It affects our attention through confirmation bias and the selective attention that we have. It affects that emotional reaction. It affects our sense of the cost and benefits, etc. And so that's the CREATE framework, which is an understanding of what it takes to take action, conscious action. Now, when we're talking habits, it's the cue, the reaction, and the ability. So it's CRA, which just doesn't sound as good, but it's true. And in the book, I also look at the reverse, what's required to stop an action that someone wants to stop. So to stop a negative habit, so for example, smoking. The analyses now look like the major factor of smoking is actually it's a habit. It's not so much the chemical dependency, though the chemical dependency is obviously a real thing too, right? And we have tools to defeat habits by using CREATE in reverse. Blocking attention, so removing the cue, bringing up strong negative associations, etc. So replacing the routine, stuff like that.
I have to admit that was kind of a shock seeing that all these years of all the medical work saying that people are addicted to smoking cigarettes because of nicotine, and new research coming out and saying, well, yeah, maybe it's just a habit. It's like, wow, I felt like, I mean, it's good to learn new things every day. It's good to not be too adhered to our old beliefs, but that was kind of a shocker.
Well, I mean, it's also part of our improved understanding of habits. And I particularly look to Wendy Wood, who is simply astounding, right? And really the source from which most of the popular press books are drawing from, right?
Absolutely.
That nicotine can be extraordinarily important. And I say this just one example, right? In general, a reward may be important, particularly important when you're repeating the behavior enough to make it a habit. But by definition, a habit is automatic. And so once that habit is formed, the reward is no longer as relevant. And in some cases, you continue even without it altogether. So it's not that nicotine or whatever the reward is wasn't important. It's just, it's not relevant for the stopping.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
As we might think. And that's, of course, Wendy, who's helped with all of this, helped us all understand this.
No kidding, man. We had a wonderful conversation with her, and that was just super. She's always super illuminating. I want to go back to the corporate world for a minute, and you brought up some of the challenges of applying behavioral science tools, techniques, all those kinds of things in the corporate world. We were talking a little bit about HR, but there's many areas. What do you think are some of the problems that or some of the misuses or maybe not ideal uses of behavioral science that need to be fixed or could be done better?
Sure. So I think of it as process, right? Politics and ethics. Those are the three big challenges. The process one is the easiest to solve, right? That's how do you actually do this stuff and watch out for potential mistakes, and how do you do this effectively? And that's what I was alluding to in the beginning, that at least as I've talked to other folks in the field and read their work as well, we've all kind of come down to the same basic blueprint of how to do this. It's a problem-solving approach. You can liken it to a double diamond in the design world. It's an iterative approach where you're identifying an obstacle, using a particular intervention, testing that in the field, right? After some discovery process. And I have the framework DECIDE in the book for that, right? Which is, I can walk through it, determining the problem, what you want to solve, looking at the context, finding the particular behavioral obstacle people are facing, picking out the intervention, et cetera, right? But frankly, there are a lot of other good frameworks out there, and underneath the hood, we're all basically doing the same thing. I think the book does a good job of giving the practical tools on how to do that, how to do a behavioral map to look out the micro actions someone takes. And I think it's a clear write-up of that process, but it's not unique, and I want to be clear on that. That process part, again, we've got a model for it. The politics side is, okay, how do you talk about this? How do you show the value? How do you build your team in a way that isn't threatening to other groups? And for me, I think it's important to recognize that nobody cares about behavioral science, and nobody should. Instead, other than us, okay, we care about it. We care about it deep, deep, deep down our hearts. But our business partners shouldn't. They shouldn't care. They should care about, are we actually helping our users? Are we building better product that is successful in the market, right? That is actually desirable and interesting? Does it actually deliver on the value proposition? Is the marketing ethically connecting with our customers and resonating in a way that others didn't? Is our HR program increasing in engagement in a thoughtful way? That's what they should care about. Behavioral science is a means, right? It's a means that I love, that I've devoted most of my professional career to, but it's still a means. And I think that helps in that politics process, right? Walk in and say, I try, to be clear, I certainly didn't do this at the beginning. I made tremendous number of mistakes. Now I just make new mistakes. But this one, I try not to walk in and say, let me tell you what behavioral science can do for you. I instead say, what problem are you facing that you can't currently solve? Okay, let me see if I can help. And if I can't, I'm like, I don't have any idea.
I think that's an interesting piece, because we have gone in, and I think many practitioners have gone into C-suites trying to say, hey, behavioral science is this, not magic silver bullet maybe, but you definitely need to understand this. You need to know this. And to your point, C-suites don't care. They don't care about the means, as you say. They care about the end results and making sure that you're achieving the outcomes, and the strategies are being fulfilled in a proper manner, and achieving whatever ROI things that they're looking for along those lines. So that's a great insight.
And I think about it as there is a real important difference between research and applied behavioral science. Both of them involve those three things, right? Both of them involve the body of work, the body of interventions, and the iterative testing. But in research, we are trying to improve our understanding of the mind. We're trying to develop new theory and test that theory, right? Applied behavioral science is engineering. It's about accomplishing something. It's not about feeling special about ourselves and showing how we have this cool tool. Now, we may along the way gain a deeper understanding of the mind, and we should publish that. And my team does, both our few successes and our many failures, right? But that's not our goal. Our goal is to accomplish something. It's to accomplish helping people change their behavior where they struggle, doing something for them.
That's terrific. I love that. I love thinking about it that way. And Thank you for reducing my job to just basically building blocks. Tinker toys. But I think that's a great way to differentiate. Really, when we think about the researchers that we talk to, they are creating the building blocks in which that we can go out into the corporate world and put to application, to build applications with. That's a great way of thinking about it.
And not to shortchange what we do, those building blocks themselves, they're not doing anything.
Yeah.
You need engineering as well as physics.
Yeah.
Right? Each have a role to play.
Yeah, you need that engineer to be able to put the building blocks together in a way that is actually going to work, because too many times you get somebody who reads predictably irrational or even thinking fast and slow, and now they're going, oh, loss aversion. Let's apply loss aversion to this. And you're sitting there going, no, please don't, because you don't understand the ramifications and the other aspects of this that are going to come into play. All right. So you talk about that, and I fully agree on the engineering analogy. Ethics is this last piece. Yes. And this is a big piece with Tim and me. So let's hear your thoughts on that.
And it is with me too. Right. There's a lot of bad stuff going on in our field. And I use the we. I don't use the them. I don't say it's those folks over at Uber who were called out in the New York Times about pushing drivers to drive and continue to drive when it's unsafe and punishing them for taking bathroom breaks, right? It's us. It's just a question of whether the New York Times has found those are particular examples yet. Right? And there are many. And by the way, actually, the New York Times has done a great job in identifying these. But look at Brignol's dark patterns site, and the page after page after page of people talking about the dirty tricks that they're seeing out there, and usually it's on the internet, right? That they're referring to, because it's particularly in digital environments. And this is not a challenge that is unique to behavioral science. The design community has confronted this and thought about it deeply for a very long time, right? And you find analyses of just how we easily lie to ourselves. And so when I think about the marketing that I've done, some of what I'm really, really proud of, and my team does marketing, it does product development, and it does original research for publication, right? I think about the marketing that we've done, and some of it I'm really proud of. And some of it I'm like, was there a clear benefit to the user here? I'm not sure. It takes recognizing that the business incentives are almost always better to sell cigarettes to kids than it is to get them to stop, right? Or to help people exercise is just a much harder sell than to sell them crappy chips. And it's not that chips and cigarettes don't have their place in society. It's a question of how do we relate to human will and the choices that people make, and an understanding that are we taking advantage of a short-term temptation, knowing that we're probably hurting somebody in the long run. And again, the design community has thought about this for a long time, and we have a lot to learn. But I also think we have something to add, which I really haven't seen in the field. Right? Now, of course, marketing has faced this, product design has faced this, everybody has faced the ethical challenges of doing business, right? This is not unique to behavioral science. But I think what we can add is the behavioral science of ethics. And this is a literature that I know isn't as familiar to many people in behavioral science, but it's a well-developed and really quite thoughtful look at how our context and how our decision-making environment affects our own ethical behavior.
Yeah, Cass Sunstein stands out as a sort of a hero in this area, but are there others that come to mind? Are there other things that we could point our readers to for the ethical application of behavioral science? Yeah,
so it's actually something different. It's not quite the ethical application of behavioral science. It's rather, what tools do we need in order to be more ethical? And first of that is applying behavioral science to ourselves. Right? And so Dan Ariely has a book called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty.
Yep.
As far as I can tell, it is his least popular, but most important book. It's the one that's so different than all the rest. Now, he has, and others from his lab and from Rotterdam have done work in this space where you test the conditions under which people are willing to lie and the conditions under which people are willing to steal. And we understand, not everything, of course, but we understand in which cases we can do this. And it all centers around this ability to lie to ourselves, the ability to feel good about who we are and what we're doing, like our proud and wonderful application of behavioral science. And at the same time, just, get the benefits of fudging things a bit. And he talks about it in his book as the fudge factor. Mm-hmm. The ease with which we can explain away our errors, right? And so if anyone on this call, and I'm certainly not including myself, if anyone on this podcast is smart or creative, then you're particularly at risk. Because it is our ability to tell stories about how, well, I'm doing this design change because, this one may not be a great thing, but it's going to help this product, and this product is going to help the company, and it's going to help our users overall, even if I probably shouldn't be promoting this feature because this thing's crappy, right? That is a narrative of self-deception. Not only do we now have an understanding of how we deceive ourselves and the conditions under which it's easier to deceive ourselves, right? We also have a set of tools to help change that. That's clear, bright lines that show what is an unethical practice, what it's not, and that's the place of guidelines. That's a place of ethical checklists. I think that's awesome, right? We see there's a nice piece in The Behavioral Scientist, for example, that talks about that. Mm-hmm. And I list our checklist in the book as well. Second, feedback. So it's not enough to have a checklist. How often do you go back and how do you see whether in fact you're straying so that the ship doesn't go too far a course, right? Independent review. You need people who don't like you or at least don't know you to help assess whether you're crossing the line. Your friends will also deceive in the same way, right? You don't want your friends on the ethical review board. You want your enemies, right? You look for things. The more that it looks like you're helping other people, the easier it is to do unethical things.
Huh.
Yeah. So, and you see this. Sadly, you see this in the history of politics as well, where this is for the greater good. I'm just going to kill these people, right? And you see those crazy lines. So how can we remove that? And again, it's about applying behavioral science to ourselves. That's what we bring to the table. Sadly, our human frailties and our ability to do unethical things, we've got nothing to add here. We're just the same as anybody else, right? The business environment, and for that matter, the nonprofit environment, I used to work in nonprofits, and the government environment, that can lead us astray. That is nothing new to behavioral science. But the ethics of behavioral science and applying it to ourselves, I think we've got something unique there that we can help with.
I would like to change the conversation to focus on music for just a little bit. And want to start by something kind of personal. What's on your playlist, Steve?
Spanish pop music right now. So Shakira, Daddy Yankee. So some really good reggaeton. Because one, I think it's just fun. And two, I'm using it to help me get back into Spanish. I studied a long time ago and I'm trying to relearn. And the other is, I've got lots of things I switch between, but right now, Christian contemporary. Huh. So I myself am a Quaker, which is not known for its religious fervor, but I just really love the music.
Any artists in particular that stand out?
Quite a lot. I just have it in the background. I just hear there. I can probably sing some of the songs for you, though that would be embarrassing. I don't know I don't know if I can say particular names.
All right. So how is the Spanish pop music working for your Spanish immersion in remembering and being able to hone up on your Spanish at this point?
Well, I have to admit, some of the language that I'm learning and practicing would be a lot more useful if I were single. Let's just say that. Single and really an asshole.
Which is always a perfect combination.
Yeah. So, given that I'm happily married, It's still just fun music.
So you just use that with your wife, right? You just it's like
that would be an interesting experience.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're always interested in is the impact that music has on your work and play life. And we're wondering if you listen to music while you're working, whatever work means to you. And are there specific things that you will listen to or won't listen to when you're working?
Yeah. I know this. Oddly, in the behavioral science community in particular, I know that this is not a popular topic. But when I need uplifting, I really listen to Christian music, right? It speaks to me, and I feel that, some of it's cheesy, but it's about love, and it's about uplifting things. And especially in these times, it's good to see that some people are still focused on caring for each other and being kind and spending time with family. I'm like, that's really cool, right? Yeah. And then when I'm really rocking on, so I do a lot of statistical programming, right, as part of my analyses. When I'm really rocking on that, then it's time for some reggaeton.
Okay.
Yeah. I also do a whole lot of country, particularly old country, not the stuff that's really rock now. But that's just when I want to sit back and I'm relaxing, and I'm not concentrating on things too much. And
how old are we talking? We're talking like Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard.
Oh yeah. No, outlaw cowboys, you bet.
Okay.
Outlaw country.
Okay.
So do you listen to music when you're writing? So I know you do, obviously you're writing the book and various different things. Is music going on in the background?
I can only write when there's classical music, or I have Anwar Boim is I'm not pronouncing his last name correctly. So some Arabic like Arabic classical style I really love, or classical Western music. I can't have words when I'm writing.
Yeah,
like we've heard that you're going to get down on the page. I can't have my own.
we've heard that with other people that we've asked. So it really interesting.
Programming for some reason, no problem, right? I can program with words and music all the time, but I have to have instrumental music when I'm writing.
That's always fascinating. Always fascinating to hear the answers to that question. Yeah. Okay, with that, we are going to say thank you very much and wrap up here. Are there any tips that you'd like to just share with listeners from the book? What would be just the most salient things that people should come away with?
Yeah, so when I think of tips, it's first, your users aren't you, but they have the same frailties. And so we want to understand their context. We understand the environment they're in, and then how we can help overcome those, right? Second, we really do have a blueprint on how to do this stuff, right? And it's not rocket science, but it does require testing. That's the part that people push back on so much. And in my view, that's just not negotiable, right? And third, if you think that ethical problems are somebody else's, then I think, you and me and all of us need to look a little deeper.
Steve, thank you. This has been both fun and enlightening, and I have pages of notes here, so that's always a really good sign. And so thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. You guys do a great podcast. It's just a long series of wonderful speakers. I'm sorry to bring down the average, but I'm honored to be here.
You did not bring down the average. And how can people get to your book or get to you if they wanted to do that?
So you can do both in one place.
Ooh, so, reduce that friction. There you go. Love it.
behavioraltechnology.co. And yes, both the British and the American spelling of behavioral will get you to the same place. So behavioral technology, I have one thing actually we didn't talk about here, which is very important. I have a free workbook that goes through all of the exercises, what you actually do. So this blueprint I mentioned, I've written it out with blanks to fill in. It says, okay, this is what you do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, including the ethical checklist, including the behavioral map, the intervention list, all of that stuff. That is free and available on behavioraltechnology.co. If folks want to have me as a speaker, I do some limited consulting as well. That's also all available on the site. And the book itself, Amazon and O'Reilly. So the Kindle book will be out by the time of this podcast is aired. end of May, and the paper book looks like it's going to come out end of second week of June.
Oh, fantastic!
So,
Perfect.
on Amazon, and there are links to both on behavioraltechnology.co.
All right. Well, once again, Steve, thank you very much, and we
so
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Steve, have a free-flowing discussion, and whatever else comes into our context-sensitive brains.
Oh yeah. Let's get context sensitive right here.
Oh, all right. So it's not like we're in contacts. What does context-sensitive mean? Come on.
That means that you're sensitive to the context, right?
And the context is what? What is the context? Let's get meta. Let's have context around the context. Let's get meta here.
Everything is the context. That's the great thing. Like
Everything.
I mean, just you and I are both fans of Robert Sapolsky, right? There's the things that are influencing us in the moment, right? Just milliseconds before these words come out of my mouth, something in my environment or the color of your shirt or something is influencing me, and there's all kinds of stuff that's been influencing us and weighing in our brain for the just marinating for the last few hours or days. And man, who we talked to and what we just read on the headlines, and that's context, man. That's
This is context, man. Context. Oh, I love it. All right. So let's take the context of our conversation with Steve Wendell and let's try to put some context around that.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What was some of the interesting things from your perspective of this conversation?
I wanted to start with talking about applying behavioral science in HR. I found that really interesting, in part because you and I have done a lot of work with human resource executives and research teams over the year. And I thought Steve did a great job of breaking it down into three really concise areas. And the first one was of focusing on employee engagement, right, and employee behavior.
Which is a big piece, right? And that's the piece that we do a lot of work in. And it's really, I think, key aspect of how behavior science can be used in human resources. Go ahead.
And there's a lot of room to grow. As much as there are companies who are, I think there are a lot of companies that are doing a pretty good job of instituting some kind of basic recognition system. There's still just a long way to go in terms of really ingraining those recognition systems into the culture. And I just think that they're doing a good job of checking the box, but maybe not a good job of really, really focusing on what it is that makes for an engaged culture. So there's more things that a lot of companies can do.
Well, and I think a lot of recent research has come out that really points to this, right? Some of the conversations we had with Brett Schuck and some others, Dan Ariely's talked about, this idea that, employees want control, employees desire recognition. We want both of those things. And how do you apply those in a contextual manner that is appropriate for your company and for your organization? That's where HR really can use some insights from behavioral science, because again, being such a contextually laden field where the same intervention that worked in company A doesn't necessarily work in company B because of some nuances of context. And that's where a behavioral scientist or a behavioral science perspective can come in to really help HR, executives and leaders understand that aspect of it, so that they're not just trying to throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks.
Or even within the company, that your customer-facing employees might get messaging and might have engagement strategies that are going to be different from people who are not customer-facing employees, for instance.
Yeah.
So, context matters, the context of their work. The second thing that Steve talked about that I thought was really interesting in this HR conversation was diversity inclusion. He brought up Iris Bonet's book about what works. And it reminded me of our conversation about hiring when we talked to Nurit Nobel. working with that organization, sort of young tech startup, and it's a bunch of young guys who are basically looking for more Star Wars geeks to join their Star Wars geek team.
Well, that was part of the application, wasn't it? It was like, or some of the interview questions were, "What's your favorite Star Wars movie?" Again, and those are, yeah, exactly, and those are those aspects that when went in and deciphered this and looked at this and made the recommendations about how to change, because you are unwittingly making decisions that are not enhancing your diversity and your inclusion. It's not necessarily intentional. But it's unknown because we just aren't aware of that. And again, behavioral science sheds this lens that we can look through in order to see that. So I like that.
And the third part of this HR conversation that Steve talked about was organizational change. It got me thinking that, wow, we spend a lot of time on strategy and as business leaders and less time on what the culture is. And Peter Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So why have business leaders not figured out how important it is to spend more time figuring out the culture than it is just to figure out the corporate strategies?
Well, and one of the things I see with companies too is that they pay lip service to culture, right? Culture is always one of the things that they talk about in their big overarching statements that they talk about, but they don't get in to really understand the culture or what is driving the culture. And culture is a really nuanced aspect, because you can have an organizational culture, you can have a divisional or department culture, you can have a small team culture, and all of those interact with each other and they play out. And those are, again, pieces where a behavioral science lens helps you not only identify what that culture is, but it helps you identify what are the drivers of that culture, and then understanding the gaps between what is the desired culture that you want with the behaviors that culture then drives or enhances versus the culture that you have, and what are some interventions that you can do in order to move from point A to point B, which is what I think organizations want and need. And to your point, that the Drucker piece, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's just true.
Yeah.
As much as you would like to believe your strategy is the be-all, end-all of making your company a success, people have to implement it, and they implement it from an emotional, cultural, influenced way.
Yeah, I like what you said about nuance, because our brains are much more comfortable with the black and the white, the yes, right, the yes, the no, the more polarized approach to the world is much easier to digest. And here, when you start talking about culture, it's a lot of gray area, and that complication makes it more difficult to deal with, and it's not as appeling. So I kind of get where we would shy away from it, but we need to. Kurt, yeah. What else caught your attention in conversation with Steve?
I want you to explain to me what epistemic humility means. It's this big damn word, and just call me, maybe I'm a little naive, maybe I'm a little country bumpkin, but what is epistemic humility? Because it sounds cool.
It sounds really cool, and you pronounced it beautifully.
Which is amazing for me, isn't it? I am normally the one who flubs those up for our listeners who may be new to this.
It's one of your superpowers, but
not.
So it was a new term to me as well. But this idea that we believe at the core of our research, this is primarily for creators, right? That at the core of our creation that we're probably wrong, and that is that's really interesting, because it goes against the endowment effect, where we say that if we own something or we create something, that we're going to love it more than something that we didn't create, right? And so to take a 180-degree turn on that and say, I have to believe that at least some portion of what I just created or just came up with or just researched was wrong.
Right.
Is really hard to do. And of course, kind of gets, Annie Duke, talks about, a lot of different ways of thinking about your decisions that spin things around. So it's not just I'm always right, but maybe I'm right. I'm confident 60% of the time in this particular issue.
Yeah, probabilistic aspect of that. It is really taking the scientific method and saying, look, we are skeptics of this, and we need to constantly be looking for those areas where our thinking may be wrong, and our the opportunity to learn more is there. And so you're skeptical about things. It's the data suggests the idea that we are always saying it is not black and white. There is a component of gray in here. And I love it. And I love the terminology. So I kind of knew what it meant. I was a little joking.
I think you knew exactly what it meant. You were just
All right. Your turn. You get to go.
We have to talk about the Decide Network.
The Decide Network? Is that like NBC or ABC or Fox? What is that?
Network. No, it's like the Decide Framework. Sorry. IDE.
But wouldn't the Decide Network be cool?
No.
How about a BS network?
Oh, the BS network. Yeah, we would be good on that. Stars of that network. So back to Decide Framework. I totally flub that. Determining what the problem is, right? That's the first thing. And I just have to say, that's really hard. To apply behavioral science in the determination of what the problem is a big problem to solve. And I don't think Steve was he wasn't trying to roll over that, but certainly I just don't want to underemphasize the importance of that. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, Kurt.
No, I agree. I think it's one of those bigger aspects. Again, going back up to this HR piece, right? And trying to understand how things get applied into HR, how behavioral science can be applied into HR. When HR is looking at a problem, are they looking at it through a behavioral science lens in order to what that problem even is? Right? So you're looking at, all right, the business is going down. We need to ramp up sales. So we need to motivate our employees more. Well, that may not be a motivation problem.
Right.
It may be a friction problem. It may be an engagement problem. It may be a systemic, other type of problem in there. And that's where behavioral science can sometimes shed some light on the emotional side, the decision-making side, that behavior. Why is the behavior happening or not happening? And that's really hard. It gets into some very difficult pieces. So yes, I would agree. Maybe 98% with you.
Thinking in bets. So the second part is E, establishing the criteria, which is, what is it that we're going to look at? What is it? How are we going to play this out? And the third one I thought was really good. The considering alternatives, the C, because this is that divergent thinking, right?
Yeah.
Where we start to expand the idea, and this is where diverse thinking on the teams. At the very least, cognitively diverse really comes into play. Right.
Well, and we talked about that in one of our Weekly Grooves episodes, right, about diversity and the idea that actually there's research out there that shows that a more diverse group looking at things is more creative than a homogenous group.
Right, and that additional creativity yields better results.
Exactly.
And then the I, so DECI is the convergent thinking. This is where we start to narrow the ideas, or just idea, and that's an important part of it because you have to develop a plan of action, right? You're going to have to get to D in order to do something about it, and then E, evaluate and monitor. Like measurement is so important. I know you're a big geek on measuring.
Yeah, I think that's really but both D's actually, the develop a plan of action and the determining what the problem is, those are actually big behavioral science pieces, because if you develop a plan of action that doesn't take into consideration behavioral science, then you are losing a lot of the value of what we can bring. And again, those are not easy things to do. It's not just a plug and play. There's not a guidebook that you go in, oh, here's the list of things that are happening, so this must be our problem, and now let's go down and we go through all this, and we have the alternative, and we've identified it. Now here is the plan of action, and we just follow these 8 steps and we're going to get there. That's not how this works. Again, we start off at the very beginning of this grooving session talking about, and context really plays a huge role in developing that plan of action, because the culture that your company has may have a big impact on what works, what doesn't work. The environment that you're playing in right now is a different time, during a pandemic than, say, last year, and probably is very different than even a month or two down the road from here. We have to understand those nuances. We have to understand those variations, because that's going to be, I think, really key to this.
Yeah.
But I think, companies, if they just watched the network, would get a lot of really great information from that television network, right? That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, the BS network or the Decide network?
Yeah, well, they're competitors, aren't they? Or are they, is one like an offshoot? Is it like, Fox, Fox Sport and Fox General, or what,
What else struck you in our conversation with Steve?
I just overall, we didn't touch on it a lot, but I think one of the biggest things for me, and we come back to this time and time again, is the ethics of behavioral science inside of organizations. And I think we need to be very clear on how we as behavioral science practitioners, as researchers, as practitioners, as anybody who is trying to implement programs that are using a behavioral science approach, we need to make sure that we're not being manipulative and that we are very forthcoming in how we're using behavioral science, because the alternative could really, in my opinion, lead to some ethical lapses that we don't want to have. We don't want to have as a practice, as a field, but also just we don't want to have, because I want to believe that people are good and that we are forthcoming in this. And I can see this particularly when it parlays. We didn't talk about marketing so much here, but marketing, you can use this to really drive some behaviors that you can get additional sales, but are they ethically done? Same thing in HR. You can think about this as to driving additional motivation, people working longer, harder, more, that may not be the most ethically clean or right things to be doing.
Right. It's more than just a bag of tricks. It's not just a stump the chump set of gimmicks. Behavioral science tools can be very powerful. And we've also talked about the ethics of with Rod Wagner about if we start to, it's possible that we could look at non-monetary rewards, recognition systems, things that improve the environment for a company, to the point where employees could remain satisfied with lower pay, and start cutting back on pay just in order to save money, make more profits. And you kind of go, we gotta really be careful with these tools and how we use them.
Yeah. I think that's a big piece there. So, all right, everybody, hang on while after this, Tim's going to do a grooming bonus for us. So listen up for that. But thank you for listening.
Hey Groovers, this is Tim with our bonus track for our discussion with Steve Wendell. Steve began our conversation sharing how behavioral science is different than the traditional fields of psychology, economics, sociology, and neuroscience as standalone disciplines. He noted 3 things that we found particularly interesting. First, behavioral science looks at the specific understanding of the mind's shortcuts, or what is referred to as heuristics. Second, behavioral science leverages a set of tools that are experimentally tested in the field to overcome obstacles. It's really more than just a big bag of tricks. Lastly, behavioral science focuses on a structural belief in experimentation. Steve introduced us to the term epistemic humility, and we loved it. We recommend that we start from a place that is at the core of our research, where we believe that we're probably wrong. And that is something that's very cool to take away from this conversation. Steve is also a master of frameworks and acronyms, and his creation of the DECIDE framework to help practitioners apply behavioral science to design efforts is really fine work. Kurt and I are keen on how it can help determine what the problem is, establish the decision criteria, push us to consider alternatives, and then identifies the best alternatives in order to develop a plan of action before evaluating and monitoring the decision. It's a practical framework, and it gives a layperson a meaningful foundation to improve the impact of their behavior change initiatives. Of course, Steve would be quick to remind us that the DECIDE framework, like all of our decisions, is context specific. Steve addressed context specifically in ethics, product design, and replication. The fact that context is primary pillar of behavior cannot be understated. Now for our groove idea for the week. As you reflect on Steve's comments about epistemic humility, think about your own life, at home or at work. How often do you think that everything that comes out of your mouth will be right? Try this. The next time you're in a meeting discussing a course of action for your new marketing campaign or sales comp plan or product strategy, apply some epistemic humility. Consider framing the idea, at least in your own mind, that you're probably wrong. Not that it could be wrong, but that it's probably wrong. Now pay attention to how your mind hears comments from other people. Pay attention to how you process the experience of your own ideas and thoughts. That frame might impact your next comment or recommendation for the better. Well, that's it for this episode. We hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation with Steve, and that you're staying safe, and that you'll leave us a review right now. Keep on grooving.